Part 2 of The Echo of a Mutiny, The Singing Bone. Related by Christopher Jarvis, M.D. To every kind of scientific work, a certain amount of manual labour naturally appertains, labour that cannot be performed by the scientist himself, since art is long but life is short. A chemical analysis involves a laborious clean-up of apparatus and laboratory, for which the chemist has no time. The preparation of a skeleton, the maceration, bleaching, assembling and riveting together of bones must be carried out by someone whose time is not too precious. And so with other scientific activities. Behind the man of science, with his outfit of knowledge, is the indispensable mechanic with his outfit of manual skill. Thorndyke's laboratory assistant, Polton, was a fine example of the latter type, deft, resourceful, ingenious, and untiring. He was somewhat of an inventive genius too, and it was one of his inventions that connected us with the singular case that I am about to record. Though by trade a watchmaker, Polton was, by choice, an optician. Optical apparatus was the passion of his life, and when one day he produced, for our inspection, an improved prism for increasing the efficiency of gas-buoys, Thorndyke at once brought the invention to the notice of a friend at the Trinity House. As a consequence, we three, Thorndyke, Polton, and I, found ourselves early on a fine July morning making our way down Middle Temple Lane, bound for the Temple Pier. A small oil launch lay alongside the pontoon, and as we made our appearance, a red-faced, white-whiskered gentleman stood up in the cockpit. "Here's a delightful morning, Doctor," he sang out in a fine, brassy, resonant, seafaring voice. "Sort of day for a trip to the lower river, eh? Hello, Polton. Coming down to take the bread out of our mouths, are you? Ha ha!" The cheery laugh rang out over the river and mingled with the throb of the engine as the little launch moved off from the pier. Captain Grumpus was one of the elder brethren of the Trinity House. Formerly a client of Thorndyke's, he had subsided, as Thorndyke's clients were apt to do, into the position of a personal friend, and his hearty regard included our invaluable assistant. "Nice state of things," continued the captain with a chuckle, "when a body of nautical experts have got to be taught their business by a parcel of lawyers and doctors, what? I suppose trade's slack, and Satan findeth mischief still, eh, Polton?" "There isn't much doing on the civil side, sir," replied Polton with a quaint, crinkly smile, "but the criminals are still going strong." "Ha! Mystery department still flourishing, what? And by Jove, talking of mysteries, Doctor, our people have got a queer problem to work out, something quite in your line, quite. Yes, and by the Lord Moses, since I've got you here, why shouldn't I suck your brains?" "Exactly," said Thorndyke. "Why shouldn't you?" "Well, then, I will," said the captain. "So here goes. All hands to the pump." He lit a cigar, and after a few preliminary puffs, began. "The mystery, shortly stated, is this. One of our lighthouse men has disappeared, vanished off the face of the earth, and left no trace. He may have bolted, he may have been drowned accidentally, or he may have been murdered. But I'd rather give you the particulars in order. At the end of last week, a barge brought into Ramsgate a letter from the Screw-Pile Lighthouse on the Girdler. There are only 2 men there, and it seems that one of them, a man named Barnett, had broken his leg, and he asked that the tender should be sent to bring him ashore. Well, it happened that the local tender, the Warden, was up on the slip in Ramsgate Harbour, having a scrape down, and wouldn't be available for a day or 2, so, as the case was urgent, the officer at Ramsgate sent a letter to the lighthouse by one of the pleasure steamers, saying that the man should be relieved by boat on the following morning, which was Saturday. He also wrote to a new hand who had just been taken on, a man named James Brown, who was lodging near Reculver, waiting his turn, telling him to go out on Saturday morning in the coastguard's boat. And he sent a third letter to the coastguard at Reculver, asking him to take Brown out to the lighthouse and bring Barnet ashore. Well, between them they made a fine muddle of it. The coastguard couldn't spare either a boat or a man, so they borrowed a fisherman's boat, and in this the man Brown started off alone, like an idiot, on the chance that Barnet would be able to sail the boat back in spite of his broken leg. Meanwhile, Barnet, who is a Whitstable man, had signalled a collier bound for his native town, and got taken off, so that the other keeper, Thomas Jeffreys, was left alone until Brown should turn up. But Brown never did turn up. The coastguard helped him to put off and saw him well out to sea, and the keeper, Jeffreys, saw a sailing boat, with one man in her, making for the lighthouse. Then a bank of fog came up and hid the boat, and when the fog cleared, she was nowhere to be seen. Man and boat had vanished and left no sign. He may have been run down in the fog, Thorndyke suggested. He may, agreed the captain, but no accident has been reported. The coastguards think he may have capsized in a squall. They saw him make the sheet fast. But there weren't any squalls. The weather was quite calm. Was he all right and well when he put off? Inquired Thorndyke. Yes, replied the captain. The coastguard's report is highly circumstantial. In fact, it's full of silly details that have no bearing on anything. This is what they say. He pulled out an official letter and read, "When last seen, the missing man was seated in the boat's stern to windward of the helm. He had belayed the sheet. He was holding a pipe and tobacco pouch in his hands, and steering with his elbow. He was filling the pipe from the tobacco pouch. There. He was holding the pipe in his hand. Mark you, not with his toes. And he was filling it from a tobacco pouch, whereas you'd have expected him to fill it from a coal scuttle or a feeding bottle." The captain rammed the letter back in his pocket and puffed scornfully at his cigar. "You are hardly fair to the coastguard," said Thorndyke, laughing at the captain's vehemence. "The duty of a witness is to give all the facts, not a judicious selection." "But, my dear sir," said Captain Grumpus, "what the deuce can it matter what the poor devil filled his pipe from?" "Who can say?" answered Thorndyke. "It may turn out to be a highly material fact. One never knows beforehand. The value of a particular fact depends on its relation to the rest of the evidence." "I suppose it does," grunted the captain, and he continued to smoke in reflective silence until we opened Blackwall Point, when he suddenly stood up. "There's a steam trawler alongside our wharf," he announced. "Now what the deuce can she be doing there?" He scanned the little steamer attentively and continued. "They seem to be landing something, too. Just pass me those glasses, Polton." "Why, hang me, it's a dead body. But why on earth are they landing it on our wharf? They must have known you were coming, Doctor." As the launch swept alongside the wharf, the captain sprang up lightly and approached the group gathered round the body. "What's this?" he asked. "Why have they brought this thing here?" The master of the trawler, who had superintended the landing, proceeded to explain. "It's one of your men, sir," said he. "We saw the body lying on the edge of the South Shingle Sand, close to the beacon, as we passed at low water. So we put off the boat and fetched it aboard. As there was nothing to identify the man by, I had a look in his pocket and found this letter." He handed the captain an official envelope addressed to Mr. J. Brown, care of Mr. Solly, Shepherd, Reculver, Kent. "Why, this is the man we were speaking about, Doctor," exclaimed Captain Grumpus. "What a very singular coincidence. But what are we to do with the body?" "You will have to write to the coroner," replied Thorndyke. "By the way, did you turn out all the pockets?" he asked, turning to the skipper of the trawler. "No, sir," was the reply. "I found the letter in the first pocket that I felt in, so I didn't examine any of the others. Is there anything more that you want to know, sir?" "Nothing but your name and address for the coroner," replied Thorndyke. And the skipper, having given this information and expressed the hope that the coroner would not keep him hanging about, returned to his vessel and pursued his way to Billingsgate. "I wonder if you would mind having a look at the body of this poor devil, while Polton is showing us his contraptions," said Captain Grumpus. "I can't do much without a coroner's order," replied Thorndyke, "but if it will give you any satisfaction, Jarvis and I will make a preliminary inspection with pleasure." "I should be glad if you would," said the captain. "We should like to know that the poor beggar met his end fairly." The body was accordingly moved to a shed, and, as Polton was led away, carrying the black bag that contained his precious model, we entered the shed and commenced our investigation. The deceased was a small, elderly man, decently dressed in a somewhat nautical fashion. He appeared to have been dead only 2 or 3 days, and the body, unlike the majority of sea-borne corpses, was uninjured by fish or crabs. There were no fractured bones or other gross injuries, and no wounds, except a rugged tear in the scalp at the back of the head. "The general appearance of the body," said Thorndyke, when he had noted these particulars, "suggests death by drowning, though, of course, we can't give a definite opinion until a post-mortem has been made." "You don't attach any significance to that scalp wound, then?" I asked. "As a cause of death? No. It was obviously inflicted during life, but it seems to have been an oblique blow that spent its force on the scalp, leaving the skull uninjured. But it is very significant in another way." "In what way?" I asked. Thorndyke took out his pocket-case and extracted a pair of forceps. "Consider the circumstances," said he. "This man put off from the shore to go to the lighthouse, but never arrived there. The question is, where did he arrive?" As he spoke, he stooped over the corpse and turned back the hair round the wound with the beak of the forceps. "Look at those white objects among the hair, Jarvis, and inside the wound. They tell us something, I think." I examined through my lens the chalky fragments to which he pointed. "These seem to be bits of shells, and the tubes of some marine worms," I said. "Yes," he answered. "The broken shells are evidently those of the acorn barnacle, and the other fragments are mostly pieces of the tubes of the common serpula. The inference that these objects suggest is an important one. It is that this wound was produced by some body encrusted by acorn barnacles and serpulae. That is to say, by a body that is periodically submerged. Now what can that body be? And how can the deceased have knocked his head against it?" "It might be the stem of a ship that ran him down," I suggested. "I don't think you would find many serpulae on the stem of a ship," said Thorndyke. "The combination rather suggests some stationary object between tide marks, such as a beacon. But one doesn't see how a man could knock his head against a beacon, while, on the other hand, there are no other stationary objects out in the estuary to knock against except buoys, and a buoy presents a flat surface that could hardly have produced this wound. By the way, we may as well see what there is in his pockets, though it is not likely that robbery had anything to do with his death." "No," I agreed, "and I see his watch is in his pocket. Quite a good silver one," I added, taking it out. "It has stopped at 12:13. "That may be important," said Thorndyke, making a note of the fact. "But we had better examine the pockets one at a time, and put things back when we have looked at them." The first pocket that we turned out was the left hip pocket of the monkey jacket. This was apparently the one that the skipper had rifled, for we found in it 2 letters, both bearing the crest of the Trinity House. These, of course, we returned without reading, and then passed on to the right pocket. The contents of this were commonplace enough, consisting of a briar pipe, a moleskin pouch, and a number of loose matches. "Rather a casual proceeding, this," I remarked, "to carry matches loose in the pocket, and a pipe with them, too." "Yes," agreed Thorndyke, "especially with these very inflammable matches. You noticed that the sticks had been coated at the upper end with sulphur before the red phosphorus heads were put on. They would light with a touch, and would be very difficult to extinguish, which, no doubt, is the reason that this type of match is so popular among seamen, who have to light their pipes in all sorts of weather." As he spoke, he picked up the pipe and looked at it reflectively, turning it over in his hand and peering into the bowl. Suddenly he glanced from the pipe to the dead man's face, and then, with the forceps, turned back the lips to look into the mouth. "Let us see what tobacco he smokes," said he. I opened the sodden pouch and displayed a mass of dark, fine-cut tobacco. "It looks like shag," I said. "Yes, it is shag," he replied. "And now we will see what is in the pipe. It has been only half smoked out." He dug out the dottle with his pocket-knife onto a sheet of paper, and we both inspected it. Clearly it was not shag, for it consisted of coarsely cut shreds and was nearly black. "Shavings from a cake of hard," was my verdict, and Thorndyke agreed as he shot the fragments back into the pipe. The other pockets yielded nothing of interest except a pocket-knife, which Thorndyke opened and examined closely. There was not much money, though as much as one would expect, and enough to exclude the idea of robbery. "Is there a sheath-knife on that strap?" Thorndyke asked, pointing to a narrow leather belt. I turned back the jacket and looked. "There is a sheath," I said, "but no knife. It must have dropped out." "That is rather odd," said Thorndyke. "A sailor's sheath-knife takes a deal of shaking out as a rule. It is intended to be used in working on the rigging when the man is aloft, so that he can get it out with one hand while he is holding on with the other. It has to be, and usually is, very secure, for the sheath holds half the handle as well as the blade. What makes one notice the matter in this case is that the man, as you see, carried a pocket-knife, and as this would serve all the ordinary purposes of a knife, it seems to suggest that the sheath-knife was carried for defensive purposes, as a weapon, in fact. However, we can't get much further in the case without a post-mortem, and here comes the captain." Captain Grumpus entered the shed and looked down commiseratingly at the dead seaman. "Is there anything, Doctor, that throws any light on the man's disappearance?" he asked. "There are one or two curious features in the case," Thorndyke replied, "but, oddly enough, the only really important point arises out of that statement of the coastguards, concerning which you were so scornful." "You don't say so!" exclaimed the captain. "Yes," said Thorndyke. "The coastguard states that when last seen, deceased was filling his pipe from his tobacco pouch. Now his pouch contains shag, but the pipe in his pocket contains hard-cut. Is there no cake tobacco in any of the pockets?" "Not a fragment. Of course it is possible that he might have had a piece and used it up to fill the pipe, but there is no trace of any on the blade of his pocket-knife, and you know how this juicy black cake stains a knife-blade. His sheath-knife is missing, but he would hardly have used that to shred tobacco when he had a pocket-knife." "No," assented the captain, "but are you sure he hadn't a second pipe?" "There was only one pipe," replied Thorndyke, "and that was not his own." "Not his own?" exclaimed the captain, halting by a huge checkered buoy to stare at my colleague. "How do you know it was not his own?" "By the appearance of the vulcanite mouthpiece," said Thorndyke. "It showed deep tooth-marks. In fact, it was nearly bitten through. Now, a man who bites through his pipe usually presents certain definite physical peculiarities, among which is, necessarily, a fairly good set of teeth. But the dead man had not a tooth in his head." The captain cogitated a while, and then remarked, "I don't quite see the bearing of this." "Don't you?" said Thorndyke. "It seems to me highly suggestive. Here is a man who, when last seen, was filling his pipe with a particular kind of tobacco. He is picked up dead, and his pipe contains a totally different kind of tobacco. Where did that tobacco come from? The obvious suggestion is that he had met someone. Yes, it does look like it, agreed the captain. Then, continued Thorndyke, there is the fact that his sheath-knife is missing. That may mean nothing, but we have to bear it in mind. And there is another curious circumstance. There is a wound on the back of the head caused by a heavy bump against some body that was covered with acorn barnacles and marine worms. Now, there are no piers or stages out in the open estuary. The question is, what could he have struck? Oh, there is nothing in that, said the captain. When a body has been washing about in a tideway for close on 3 days— But this is not a question of a body, Thorndyke interrupted. The wound was made during life. The deuce it was, exclaimed the captain. Well, all I can suggest is that he must have fouled one of the beacons in the fog, stove in his boat, and bumped his head, though I must admit that's a rather lame explanation. He stood for a minute gazing at his toes with a cogitative frown, and then looked up at Thorndyke. I have an idea, he said. From what you say, this matter wants looking into pretty carefully. Now, I am going down on the tender today to make inquiries on the spot. What do you say to coming with me as adviser? As a matter of business, of course. You and Dr. Jarvis. I shall start about 11. We shall be at the lighthouse by 3 o'clock. And you can get back to town tonight if you want to. What do you say? There's nothing to hinder us, I put in eagerly, for even at Bugsby's Hole the river looked very alluring on this summer morning. Very well, said Thorndyke. We will come. Jarvis is evidently hankering for a sea trip, and so am I, for that matter. It's a business engagement, you know, the captain stipulated. Nothing of the kind, said Thorndyke. It's unmitigated pleasure, the pleasure of the voyage, and your high, well-born society. I didn't mean that, grumbled the captain. But if you are coming as guests, send your man for your night gear, and let us bring you back tomorrow evening. We won't disturb Polton, said my colleague. We can take the train from Blackwall and fetch our things ourselves. 11 o'clock, you said? Thereabouts, said Captain Grumpus. But don't put yourselves out. The means of communication in London have reached an almost undesirable state of perfection. With the aid of the snorting train and the tinkling two-wheeled gondola, we crossed and recrossed the town with such celerity that it was barely 11 when we reappeared on Trinity Wharf with a joint Gladstone and Thorndyke's little green case. The tender had hauled out of Bow Creek, and now lay alongside the wharf, with a great striped can buoy dangling from her derrick, and Captain Grumpus stood at the gangway, his jolly red face beaming with pleasure. The buoy was safely stowed forward, the derrick hauled up to the mast, the loose shrouds rehooked to the screw lanyards, and the steamer, with 4 jubilant hoots, swung round and shoved her sharp nose against the incoming tide. For near upon 4 hours, the ever-widening stream of the London River unfolded its moving panorama. The smoke and smell of Woolwich Reach gave place to lucid air made soft by the summer haze. The grey huddle of factories fell away, and green levels of cattle-spotted marsh stretched away to the highland bordering the river valley. Venerable training ships displayed their checkered hulls by the wooden shore, and whispered of the days of oak and hemp, when the tall 3-decker, comely and majestic, with her soaring heights of canvas like towers of ivory, had not yet given place to the mud-coloured saucepans that fly the white ensign nowadays and devour the substance of the British taxpayer, when a sailor was a sailor and not a mere seafaring mechanic. Sturdily breasting the flood tide, the tender threaded her way through the endless procession of shipping, barges, billy-boys, schooners, brigs, lumpish black seamen, blue-funnelled China tramps, rickety Baltic barques with twirling windmills, gigantic liners staggering under a mountain of top hamper. Erith, Purfleet, Greenhithe, Grays greeted us and passed astern. The chimneys of Northfleet, the clustering roofs of Gravesend, the populous anchorage and the lurking batteries were left behind, and as we swung out of the Lower Hope, the wide expanse of sea reach spread out before us like a great sheet of blue-shot satin. About 12:30 the ebb overtook us and helped us on our way, as we could see by the speed with which the distant land slid past, and the freshening of the air as we passed through it. But sky and sea were hushed in a summer calm. Balls of fleecy cloud hung aloft, motionless in the soft blue. The barges drifted on the tide with drooping sails, and a big striped bell-buoy, surmounted by a staff and cage and labelled Shivering Sand, sat dreaming in the sun above its motionless reflection, to rouse for a moment as it met our wash, nod its cage drowsily, utter a solemn ding-dong, and fall asleep again. It was shortly after passing the buoy that the gaunt shape of a screw-pile lighthouse began to loom up ahead. Its dull red paint turned to vermilion by the early afternoon sun. As we drew nearer, the name Girdler, painted in huge white letters, became visible, and two men could be seen in the gallery around the lantern, inspecting us through a telescope. "Shall you be long at the lighthouse, sir?" the master of the tender inquired of Captain Grumpus. "Because we're going down to the north-east Pan Sand to fix this new buoy and take up the old one." "Then you'd better put us off at the lighthouse and come back for us when you've finished the job," was the reply. "I don't know how long we shall be." The tender was brought to, a boat lowered, and a couple of hands pulled us across the intervening space of water. "It will be a dirty climb for you in your shore-going clothes," the captain remarked. He was as spruce as a new pin himself. "But the stuff will all wipe off." We looked up at the skeleton shape. The falling tide had exposed some 15 feet of the piles, and piles and ladder alike were swathed in seagrass and encrusted with barnacles and worm tubes. But we were not such town sparrows as the captain seemed to think, for we both followed his lead without difficulty up the slippery ladder, Thorndyke clinging tenaciously to his little green case, from which he refused to be separated even for an instant. "These gentlemen and I," said the captain as we stepped on the stage at the head of the ladder, "have come to make inquiries about the missing man, James Brown. Which of you is Jeffreys?" "I am, sir," replied a tall, powerful, square-jawed, beetle-browed man, whose left hand was tied up in a rough bandage. "What have you been doing to your hand?" asked the captain. "I cut it while I was peeling some potatoes," was the reply. "It isn't much of a cut, sir." "Well, Jeffreys," said the captain, "Brown's body has been picked up, and I want particulars for the inquest. You'll be summoned as a witness, I suppose. So come in and tell us all you know." We entered the living-room and seated ourselves at the table. The captain opened a massive pocket-book, while Thorndyke, in his attentive, inquisitive fashion, looked about the odd cabin-like room as if making a mental inventory of its contents. Geoffrey's statement added nothing to what we already knew. He had seen a boat with one man in it making for the lighthouse. Then the fog had drifted up, and he had lost sight of the boat. He started the foghorn and kept a bright lookout, but the boat never arrived. And that was all he knew. He supposed that the man must have missed the lighthouse and been carried away on the ebb tide, which was running strongly at the time. "What time was it when you last saw the boat?" Thorndyke asked. "About 11:30, replied Jeffreys. "What was the man like?" asked the captain. "I don't know, sir. He was rowing, and his back was towards me." "Had he any kit bag or chest with him?" asked Thorndyke. "He'd got his chest with him," said Jeffries. What sort of chest was it? Inquired Thorndyke. A small chest, painted green, with rope beckets. Was it corded? It had a single cord round, to hold the lid down. Where was it stowed? In the stern sheets, sir. How far off was the boat when you last saw it? About half a mile. Half a mile! Exclaimed the captain. Why, how the deuce could you see what the chest was like half a mile away? The man reddened and cast a look of angry suspicion at Thorndyke. I was watching the boat through the glass, sir, he replied sulkily. I see, said Captain Grumpus. Well, that will do, Jeffries. We have to arrange for you to attend the inquest. Tell Smith I want to see him. The examination concluded, Thorndyke and I moved our chairs to the window, which looked out over the sea to the east. But it was not the sea or the passing ships that engaged my colleague's attention. On the wall beside the window hung a rudely carved pipe rack containing 5 pipes. Thorndyke had noted it when we entered the room, and now, as we talked, I observed him regarding it from time to time with speculative interest. You men seem to be inveterate smokers, he remarked to the keeper, Smith, when the captain had concluded the arrangements for the shift. Well, we do like our bit of baccy, sir, that's a fact, answered Smith. You see, sir, he continued, it's a lonely life, and tobacco's cheap out here. How's that? Asked Thorndyke. Why, we get it given to us. The small craft from foreign parts, especially the Dutchmen, generally heave us a cake or two when they pass close. We're not ashore, you see, so there's no duty to pay. So you don't trouble the tobacconists much? Don't go in for cut tobacco? No, sir, we'd have to buy it, and then the cut stuff wouldn't keep. No, it's hard tack to eat out here, and hard tobacco to smoke. I see you've got a pipe rack, too. Quite a stylish affair. Yes, said Smith. I made it in my off-time. Keeps the place tidy and looks more ship-shape than letting the pipes lay about anywhere. Someone seems to have neglected his pipe, said Thorndyke, pointing to one at the end of the rack, which was coated with green mildew. Yes, that's Parsons, my mate. He must have left it when he went off near a month ago. Pipes do go mouldy in the damp air out here. How soon does a pipe go mouldy if it is left untouched? Thorndyke asked. It's according to the weather, said Smith. When it's damp and warm, they'll begin to go in about a week. Now, here's Barnett's pipe that he left behind. The man that broke his leg, you know, sir. It's just beginning to spot a little. He couldn't have used it for a day or two before he went. And are all these other pipes yours? No, sir. This here one is mine. The end one is Jeffries. And I suppose the middle one is his too, but I don't know it. You're a demon for pipes, Doctor, said the captain, strolling up at this moment. You seem to make a special study of them. The proper study of mankind is man, replied Thorndyke, as the keeper retired. And man includes those objects on which his personality is impressed. Now, a pipe is a very personal thing. Look at that row in the rack. Each has its own physiognomy, which, in a measure, reflects the peculiarities of the owner. There is Jeffries' pipe at the end, for instance. The mouthpiece is nearly bitten through, the bowl scraped to a shell and scored inside, and the brim battered and chipped. The whole thing speaks of rude strength and rough handling. He chews the stem as he smokes. He scrapes the bowl violently, and he bangs the ashes out with unnecessary force. And the man fits the pipe exactly. Powerful, square-jawed, and, I should say, violent on occasion. Yes, he looks a tough customer, does Jeffries, agreed the captain. Then, continued Thorndyke, there is Smith's pipe next to it, coked up until the cavity is nearly filled, and burnt all round the edge. A talker's pipe, constantly going out and being relit. But the one that interests me most is the middle one. Didn't Smith say that was Jeffries too? I said. Yes, replied Thorndyke, but he must be mistaken. It is the very opposite of Geoffrey's pipe in every respect. To begin with, although it is an old pipe, there is not a sign of any tooth mark on the mouthpiece. It is the only one in the rack that is quite unmarked. Then the brim is quite uninjured. It has been handled gently. And the silver band is jet black, whereas the band on Geoffrey's pipe is quite bright. I hadn't noticed that it had a band, said the captain. What has made it so black? Thorndyke lifted the pipe out of the rack and looked at it closely. Silver sulphide, said he. The sulphur no doubt derived from something carried in the pocket. I see, said Captain Grumpass, smothering a yawn, and gazing out of the window at the distant tender. Incidentally, it's full of tobacco. What moral do you draw from that? Thorndyke turned the pipe over and looked closely at the mouthpiece. The moral is, he replied, that you should see that your pipe is clear before you fill it. He pointed to the mouthpiece, the bore of which was completely stopped up with fine fluff. An excellent moral, too, said the captain, rising with another yawn. If you'll excuse me a minute, I'll go and see what the tender is up to. She seems to be crossing to the east girdler. He reached the telescope down from its brackets and went out onto the gallery. As the captain retreated, Thorndyke opened his pocket-knife and, sticking the blade into the bowl of the pipe, turned the tobacco out into his hand. "Shag, by Jove!" I exclaimed. "Yes," he answered, poking it back into the bowl. "Didn't you expect it to be shag?" "I don't know that I expected anything," I admitted. "The silver band was occupying my attention." "Yes, that's an interesting point," said Thorndyke. "But let us see what the obstruction consists of." He opened the green case and, taking out a dissecting needle, neatly extracted a ball of fluff from the bore of the pipe. Laying this on a glass slide, he teased it out in a drop of glycerine and put on a cover glass, while I set up the microscope. "Better put the pipe back in the rack," he said, as he laid the slide on the stage of the instrument. I did so, and then turned, with no little excitement, to watch him as he examined the specimen. After a brief inspection, he rose and waved his hand towards the microscope. "Take a look at it, Jarvis," he said, "and let us have your learned opinion." I applied my eye to the instrument and, moving the slide about, identified the constituents of the little mass of fluff. The ubiquitous cotton fibre was, of course, in evidence, and a few fibres of wool. But the most remarkable objects were 2 or 3 hairs, very minute hairs of a definite zigzag shape, and having a flat expansion near the free end, like the blade of a paddle. "These are the hairs of some small animal," I said. "Not a mouse or rat, or any rodent, I should say. Some small insectivorous animal, I fancy." "Yes, of course. They are the hairs of a mole." I stood up, and, as the importance of the discovery flashed on me, I looked at my colleague in silence. "Yes," he said, "they are unmistakable, and they furnish the keystone of the argument." "You think that this is really the dead man's pipe, then?" I said. "According to the law of multiple evidence," he replied, "it is practically a certainty. Consider the facts in sequence. Since there is no sign of mildew on it, this pipe can have been here only a short time, and must belong either to Barnett, Smith, Jeffreys, or Brown. It is an old pipe, but it has no tooth marks on it. Therefore it has been used by a man who has no teeth. But Barnett, Smith, and Jeffreys all had teeth and marked their pipes, whereas Brown had no teeth. The tobacco in it is shag. But these 3 men do not smoke shag, whereas Brown had shag in his pouch. The silver band is encrusted with sulphide, and Brown carried sulphur-tipped matches loose in his pocket with his pipe. We find hairs of a mole in the bore of the pipe, and Brown carried a moleskin pouch in the pocket in which he appears to have carried his pipe. Finally, Brown's pocket contained a pipe which was obviously not his, and which closely resembled that of Geoffrey's. It contained tobacco similar to that which Geoffrey smokes, and different from that in Brown's pouch. It appears to me quite conclusive, especially when we add to this evidence the other items that are in our possession. What items are they? I asked. First, there is the fact that the dead man had knocked his head heavily against some periodically submerged body covered with acorn barnacles and serpulae. Now, the piles of this lighthouse answer to the description exactly, and there are no other bodies in the neighbourhood that do, for even the beacons are too large to have produced that kind of wound. Then the dead man's sheath knife is missing, and Geoffrey's has a knife wound on his hand. You must admit that the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. At this point the captain bustled into the room with the telescope in his hand. "The tender is coming up, towing a strange boat," he said. "I expect it's the missing one, and if it is, we may learn something. You'd better pack up your traps and get ready to go on board." We packed the green case and went out into the gallery, where the two keepers were watching the approaching tender. Smith frankly curious and interested, Geoffrey's restless, fidgety, and noticeably pale. As the steamer came opposite the lighthouse, 3 men dropped into the boat and pulled across, and one of them, the mate of the tender, came climbing up the ladder. "Is that the missing boat?" the captain sang out. "Yes, sir," answered the officer, stepping onto the staging and wiping his hands on the reverse aspect of his trousers. "We saw her lying on the dry patch of the east girdler. There's been some hanky-panky in this job, sir. Foul play, you think, eh?" "Not a doubt of it, sir. The plug was out and lying loose in the bottom, and we found a sheath knife sticking into the kelson for'ard among the coils of the painter. It was stuck in hard, as if it had dropped from a height." "That's odd," said the captain. "As to the plug, it might have got out by accident." "But it hadn't, sir," said the mate. "The ballast bags had been shifted along to get the bottom boards up. Besides, sir, a seaman wouldn't let the boat fill. He'd have put the plug back and bailed out." "That's true," replied Captain Grumpus, "and certainly the presence of the knife looks fishy. But where the deuce could it have dropped from, out in the open sea? Knives don't drop from the clouds, fortunately. What do you say, Doctor?" "I should say that it is Brown's own knife, and that it probably fell from this staging." Geoffreys turned swiftly, crimson with wrath. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "Haven't I said that the boat never came here?" "You have," replied Thorndyke. "But if that is so, how do you explain the fact that your pipe was found in the dead man's pocket, and that the dead man's pipe is at this moment in your pipe rack?" The crimson flush on Geoffrey's face faded as quickly as it had come. "I don't know what you're talking about," he faltered. "I'll tell you," said Thorndyke. "I will relate what happened, and you shall check my statements. Brown brought his boat alongside and came up into the living-room, bringing his chest with him. He filled his pipe and tried to light it, but it was stopped and wouldn't draw. Then you lent him a pipe of yours and filled it for him. Soon afterwards you came out on this staging and quarrelled. Brown defended himself with his knife, which dropped from his hand into the boat. You pushed him off the staging, and he fell, knocking his head on one of the piles. Then you took the plug out of the boat and sent her adrift to sink, and you flung the chest into the sea. This happened about 10 minutes past 12. Am I right?" Geoffrey stood staring at Thorndyke, the picture of amazement and consternation, but he uttered no word in reply. "Am I right?" Thorndyke repeated. "Strike me blind," muttered Jeffries. "Was you here, then? You talk as if you had been. Anyhow," he continued, recovering somewhat, "you seem to know all about it, but you're wrong about one thing. There was no quarrel. This chap Brown didn't take to me, and he didn't mean to stay out here. He was going to put off and go ashore again, and I wouldn't let him. Then he hit out at me with his knife, and I knocked it out of his hand, and he staggered backwards and went overboard." "And did you try to pick him up?" asked the captain. "How could I?" demanded Jeffries, "with the tide racing down, and me alone on the station. I'd never have got back." "But what about the boat, Jeffries? Why did you scuttle her?" "The fact is," replied Jeffries, "I got in a funk, and I thought the simplest plan was to send her to the cellar and know nothing about it, but I never shoved him over. It was an accident, sir. I swear it." "Well, that sounds a reasonable explanation," said the captain. "What do you say, Doctor?" "Perfectly reasonable," replied Thorndyke. "And, as to its truth, that is no affair of ours." "No, but I shall have to take you off, Jeffries, and hand you over to the police. You understand that?" "Yes, sir, I understand," answered Jeffries. "That was a queer case, that affair on the Girdler," remarked Captain Grumpus, when he was spending an evening with us some 6 months later. "A pretty easy let-off for Jeffries, too. 18 months, wasn't it?" "Yes, it was a very queer case indeed," said Thorndyke. "There was something behind that accident, I should say. Those men had probably met before." "So I thought," agreed the captain. "But the queerest part of it to me was the way you nosed it all out. I've had a deep respect for briar pipes since then. It was a remarkable case," he continued. "The way in which you made that pipe tell the story of the murder seems to me like sheer enchantment." "Yes," said I, "it spoke like the magic pipe. Only that wasn't a tobacco pipe. In the German folk story of the singing bone, do you remember it? A peasant found the bone of a murdered man and fashioned it into a pipe. But when he tried to play on it, it burst into a song of its own. 'My brother slew me and buried my bones beneath the sand and under the stones.'" "Ah, a pretty story," said Thorndyke, "and one with an excellent moral. The inanimate things around us have each of them a song to sing to us, if we are but ready with attentive ears." That is the end of The Echo of a Mutiny, Part 2, by R. Austin Freeman, read by Greg Wagland for Magpie Audio 2025. And there we have it. Please subscribe, please make a comment, leave a comment, do a thumbs up, do a thumbs down, do whate'er you will. But thanks for listening.